Sandrine Sanos, who is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi, to offer a comment on these papers. And we are lucky to have Sandrine with us. She got her PhD in modern European history from Rutgers University and has recently published, 2012, pretty recently, published her book with Stanford University Press, The Aesthetics of Hate, Far-Right Intellectuals, Anti-Semitism and Gender in 1930s France. Scary stuff. And many of her publications explore these themes of the far right, race, gender, and sexuality. But one slightly more unusual, I think is quite interesting, came out in the Journal of Postcolonial Writing, volume 47, number 1, Bhangra Blues, Melancholy, Memory, and History in Gurinder Chadha's I'm British, But. I'm sure that you will talk to us more about music and history and these rich papers today. Thanks, Sandrine.
I'll stay here, and if that's okay. So it's a pleasure to comment on these papers which illuminate the possibilities of cultural history using musicians, using musical forms, and music as a text, even though all three exemplify different approaches. So I'll just maybe rush through a little bit. I'm sure there are many questions to what you have today. So Bronson Long's paper analyzes the content of Jacques Brel's songs and urges us to consider Brel as an underappreciated critic whose songs offered a sustained political critique. So Long has shown us how Brel's songs, or rather his lyrics, offered a denunciation of the Algerian War, and through the course of the 1950s and 60s, satirized Belgian culture and identity, or belgitude. Both, he argues, were part of his overall critique of bourgeois values. Now, going back to some of the songs you mentioned, I wonder whether you could elaborate specifically on La Colombe, the song he wrote about the Algerian War, which interestingly hasn't made it into the canon of Brel's most iconic songs, and its release in 1959, as you suggest, is significant insofar as most accounts of the scandal of torture had emerged in 58 and 59. And aside from a minority of intellectuals associated with the Sartrean left, most were denouncing it in moral terms rather than political terms. So I was wondering how you see Brel's denunciation of the Algerian War as part of this larger intellectual context. Because on the one hand, like the other two you mentioned, Ça va and La Bastille, it actually seems that La Colombe fits in a rather longer tradition of anti-militarist and humanist chansons. So what makes this distinct in this moment? And in fact, what struck me about that particular song was not so much his critique of the war, but the fate of the soldier, of the ordinary soldier who goes to war as the motif. These young conscripts that cross the Mediterranean that we've heard about in Jonathan and Elizabeth's paper, who were asked to, but then ended up exercising brutal violence. And in fact, you could also argue this fits into Brel's ongoing dramatization of the failures of heterosexual masculinity. I mean, Au Suivant, for instance, is a good instance of that. So I think my question overall relates to how you can see Brel as situating within the post-war context of intellectual and cultural, of a meditation on the human that was circulating then. I was also intrigued by another detail, the fact that you said, well, in the paper, that he wasn't considered seriously by contemporary intellectuals, Sartre and Aron. And that was surprising to me. I mean, Sartre and Beauvoir were enthusiastic cabaret goers, left bank visitors, and they were known to have loved Gréco songs, for instance, quite extensively. And Brel, like Gréco, like Ferré, like Brassens, had begun in the left bank cabarets. Now, it is true that in contrast to Ferré, he certainly was not as political, and you highlight that, or publicly political, but neither was Gréco. So I'm interested as to what would make Brel unpopular as opposed to others. And I think that speaks to what you point to, which is the perception of Brel, and what you are trying to recover. Even though it is Brel who now inspires young generations, I was thinking about your claim that he is a political critic in his own right, with a recent cover by Abdel Malik of actually one of my favorite Brel songs, Ces gens-là, which he released 2 years ago, and it was incredibly popular. So it is him, not Ferré, not Reggiani, not any others, who inspires now. So this is for Brel. As for Algerian jazz, Elizabeth MacGregor focuses instead on the context and reception of jazz music in colonial and post-colonial Algeria, reminding us here that musical creation and performance are situated within particular contexts that shape their meaning. And you offer a fascinating continuation of the work that Jeffrey Jackson and Matthew Jordan have undertaken with jazz and interwar culture. So it's interesting that you begin by saying that politics, and I quote, rarely entered into French discussions about jazz in Algeria during the war, because going back to Jordan and Jackson, they highlight how, in fact, jazz was very much about these interwar political anxieties. And in some sense, you suggest that after World War II, by then, jazz had been made French, which was not the case before. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on this relation between metropolitan and colonial jazzmen and the ways in which jazz was disseminated, specifically on the role of the radio. You mentioned this Bichard Jazz program, for instance. The radio, ever since the interwar, had been an instrument of propaganda, but also of cultural hybridity. And you point out that, to some, jazz embodied musicians' sense of belonging to multiple homelands, while for others, it fit into a fantasy of a form of life under that hot African sun. Now, I wonder if this actually translated into the types of jazz that were performed and that circulated. Was there an Algerian jazz that was distinct as musical performance, or did its categorization as French by metropolitan jazzmen erase or sort of displace possible differences? I was also interested in the role of the soldiers in this dissemination of jazz, which you suggest eclipsed the settler fans in terms of notoriety and influence. Now, could you elaborate on the reasons why you state these were ideal? They were an ideal audience for radio broadcasts and concern. And I was wondering last, and this was actually in the version of the paper I got, whether you could elaborate on the shift you see taking place after the independence of Algeria. So you suggest that a Colon jazz scene is completely replaced by an Algerian one. And I'm wondering sort of how that worked, and if you could say more, whether there might be different genealogies, because you seem to read the jazz scene solely in terms of a movement between France and Algeria, and considering the celebration of blackness, sort of, are there different genealogies we could see? Especially since you point out jazz was both political and depoliticized, which is actually could be said about Johnny Hallyday, and sort of the same thing. So Jonathan Briggs examines the ways in which popular icon Johnny was himself a cultural object that fit in larger political discourse after '62. And you highlight how his military service became the occasion for a distinctive post-colonial nationalist discourse that sought to imagine a particular form of Frenchness intent on recovering a nation divided by the Algerian War. Now, I want to turn to one statement you make. You said this is about the continued strength of French nationalism. It seems instead, and I think that's what you're getting at, that it's an important instance of a remapping of a post-colonial French nationalism. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that a bit more. Now, you suggest the publicity and participation of Hallyday in the spectacle of his military service helped both erase the experience of the soldiers who had returned traumatized, but also perpetrators of violence, and help forget the war, especially as Salut les copains said, they would heal the divisions of French society. Between young and old. But I wonder if that desire to unite or heal was also a matter of erasing class divisions at a moment in which leisure culture, consumerism, modernization were redefining France, and how class figures in that desire to offer Hallyday. And Hallyday appealed, I think, as you brilliantly demonstrated, because he's Sergeant Smet. So it's not just that he's an ordinary soldier, but that in this ORTF clip, he's a sergeant leading his men. So he's shown equally at ease, leading them to fight, to practice fighting, as he is singing to them. So, and I think that distinction is quite important. And in fact, I mean, Hallyday here appears like the naturalized empty sign that Roland Barthes might have written in his mythologie, you know, sort of Johnny en caserne as a myth. And I think the images evoke that. Now, I just want you to elaborate a bit more about the question of masculinity, because could it be that what made Johnny so effective as a cultural sign is that he embodied the comforting fantasy of a respectable yet youthful French masculinity, in contrast at the time or in the years prior to the allegedly animalistic, uncontained Algerian men on metropolitan soils, sort of who were sexually excessive, or the sexualized jeune fille that appeared everywhere at the same time. And Hallyday seemed particularly willing and eager to participate in this sort of sign of offering not violence, but a transformative coming of age into a properly regulated and modern-oriented male citizenry. So just to conclude very quickly, as I read these papers, to me, it wasn't so much the Algerian War that was at stake, but the figure of the French soldier that is especially prominent as a cultural sign, as audience, and as performer. So what may then this suggest about the ways in which masculinity was being redefined in a post-war era as a foundation of a political imagination of a post-colonial France? I mean, this is after a long and brutal war involving torture, granting the vote to women, and a changing society. So how may the status of a precarious masculinity be at stake in these instances of musical creation and performance? And really my last question relates to the practice of cultural history, as I do not work on music. And I wonder if you could share your thoughts on methodology, very simply. How might we as historians attend to the effective dimensions of sound and music? That is, how music emotionally constitutes a public in the same way as radio or as newspapers did before, and what are the possibilities of possibilities and challenges of that? And what of the disharmony of our panel's title? Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed these papers.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, again, because I'm sure we have questions here, I'll ask you just to very briefly each respond, maybe take a minute each, choose one of Sandrine's charges, and quickly respond, and then we'll turn it out to the gathering here.
Sure. Bob, just very quickly, first to your second point, I think part of the reason why intellectuals such as Sartre and even Francois Mauriac negatively reacted to Brel is they perceived his music to be too close to American music, and I think falsely perceived it. There's this idea of that. Also, for La Colombe, the song is very interesting in that Algeria is not specifically mentioned. There's no specific war mentioned in this. But if you listen to the lyrics and particularly pay close attention to them, images of soldiers leaving by railroad, departing from their families, celebration of soldiers departing, it reminds me a lot of the First World War. And there's a hearkening back to previous wars, I think. And you get a sense of this, or at least this is my reading of this, is here we go again, right? Celebrating, we're going in, these soldiers leaving off to war, and it's going to be another bloody mess. Because this, war in the military is always negative in Brel's music. It doesn't really matter what war it is. And so even though he doesn't name Algeria and torture specifically, it's very clear where all this is going, and I think at least in his mind.
Okay, I'm going to answer your question about that shift after 1962 because I find it fascinating that before 1962, jazz in Algeria is completely connected to the colonizers. After 1962, there's a period of some silence of a few years, and then there is a movement among Algerians in this new nation to appreciate jazz in a completely different way. So to contextualize it a little bit, in the United States, in the latter half of the 1960s, free jazz is becoming more popular and better known, and it's very much intertwined with black nationalism and an African identity. And so the Algerians get wind of that and start appreciating jazz as a music with intrinsic African connections. And so we see a move away from relying on a French version of jazz to moving to an African-American / African version of jazz. And we see the American State Department starts sending jazz musicians across the world, which is a whole other topic. But men like Archie Shepp, Randy Weston start touring in Algeria. And then in 1969, there's a Pan-African festival in Algiers. It's this huge festival, and jazz has a pretty sizable platform at this festival. And I should show this video clip of Archie Shepp on stage, like shouting out, like, jazz is African, we're returning to Africa. So there were French attendees at the concert, at the festival, who recorded and produced records and things like that. But French jazz musicians as performers and as leaders in this endeavor disappear. So that after 1962, there's a shift to appreciating jazz for a completely different reason, because it is connected to Africa in a sense of black nationalism.
So very, very quickly, one of the kind of fascinating things, Sandrine, that we have to remember is that much of the readership of these youth magazines were in fact young women who really drove the sales of this. So it's kind of fascinating because in one sense it is this remapping of French nationalism, but it's also one that's only mapped really for men. This is the pathway for men to kind of participate in this national project. And of course Halliday himself, the sexuality of Johnny Halliday. I could go on. But the idea here is that initially he was seen as quite feminine in many of the ways, like that Elvis was seen as this kind of feminized thing, and the work of Uta Poiger has kind of spoken to this. But very, very quickly he does become kind of masculinized within the kind of visual discourse itself. So it is this kind of fascinating thing that's happening there with this kind of turn to traditional modes of sexuality and sexual difference here. So, and National Service only reinforces that, I see.
Excellent. Just introduce yourself and then speak loudly.
Bethany Keenan. I have a question for John and Elizabeth about how these music essays play into creating ideals drastically separated from reality. So for Elizabeth, I was thinking about, especially when you're talking about French Algerians conceptualizing themselves as Algerian, the way in which it seems a lot of French jazz music creates an ideal African-American that is separated from any reality of what African-American life is like. And I was thinking also of what Tyler Stovall shows about how the role Paris plays for African-American musicians, but also the conflict in his article, The Fire This Time, of how the Algerian War poses a problem. So I was wondering if you could speak to how African-American jazz musicians deal with the concept of jazz during the war and how this fits into this French conception of what African-American jazz is. And for John, I was wondering, I love the images, but sexy as Johnny is, he is attached to the songs. So I was wondering, are there songs that Johnny does that are specifically soldier-based that would morally reinforce this masculinity of French nationalism?
Well, there has been a reading, I'm not quite convinced of it, but there's been a reading of Le Pénitencier as Ali Day kind of talking about how he's in fact a prisoner in the army. His own service was perhaps the mildest service that any sergeant could have taken. So it seems like a kind of extravagant interpretation. But no, he doesn't really speak to within his music to kind of military concerns at all. It seems that he just continues on his kind of cultural path, if you will. So it's a strange disconnect to have the image of the soldier and yet the song that does everybody know the Penitencier? It's a cover of the House of the Rising Sun. Does everybody know the House of the Rising Sun? Yeah. Which it actually would speak in many ways to, because I think of what Bronson talked about in visiting prostitutes and this kind of experience of the soldier, but he doesn't engage with that at all.
It's a great question, and I could go on and on answering it. I have a whole chapter about race, and these French jazz critics and fans talk constantly back in France about the African-American musician and his almost always his supremacy. Yes, a little bit of Ella Fitzgerald and stuff, but the ideal jazz musician is a black American man. And I would love to get more feedback and hear the voice of these musicians who do tour to a small degree in French Algeria, the Americans who go. I haven't seen those voices yet, though. I do, in Randy Weston's autobiography that he writes late in the second half of the 60s, writing about his experience in Algeria, he basically says, for the first time, we're getting to expose audiences to a real jazz, not one that's kind of, that European musicians kind of fake and mimic and promote as their own. But, and there's, yeah, and the move by most French critics back in France is to say that we appreciate black art, African-American art. We don't discriminate, and going to Tyler Stovall in Paris and how there is a sizable African-American community in Paris, and the French largely position themselves as treating African-Americans better than Americans do, and talking about the civil rights and going into great detail about different activities in the American civil rights movement to educate the French jazz fan population about these things. So race is huge running through it, and I think it's also fascinating that all of this conversation about race in the context of America, it's not used to really reflect back on the French situation. It's not used to reflect on, oh, we're engaged in this war and maybe we shouldn't be, or to reflect on growing numbers of immigrants coming to France. It's sometimes mentioned, but very, very rarely.
Michael.
Yeah, Michael, I'm Jonathan. I've been doing a side project on Cold War masculinities, Imperial Cold War masculinities, looking at Elvis, Captain Kirk, and Steve McGarrett from Hawaii Five-O. It's really central to all of that sense of American masculinity is sexual opportunity and empire as possibilities for sexual conquest. So the Johnny experience is really derivative from the Elvis experience. But central to the Elvis experience, especially in films like GI Blues, but also the other films where he's a returning soldier, is sexual conquest. And it's so much a part of that kind of masculinity that the films, and probably the films are trying to describe. But it seems that the Johnny experience here, it seems to be very derivative, is really, really different. It's not describing empire, it's creating decolonization. And he doesn't seem to be on the path of sexual contact. He's hanging out with the guys and am I reading that right?
Absolutely. So there are a series of photographs taken. By this point, he is, I guess you would say, engaged to Sylvie Vartan, who would be his first wife and the love of his life, if you ask him, I suppose. And there's a sense of domesticity and coupling, which Kristen Ross has written about this extensively in post-war France, but it's not about sexual conquest, but indeed camaraderie. I think that's the more important point here. So, yes. Yes, we should talk more.
And I'm sorry to cut this off. I'm conscious that we are absolutely at the end of our time. Unfortunately, I have so many things I could say. I hope you admire my self-sacrifice and holding back. But I hope we can continue these conversations over coffee, as always, or tea, or your beverage of choice, perhaps later in the evening. And this was a very early panel for a panel on pop music. Did anybody else find that really funny? So, yeah, thank you again to our panelists, to our commentators, and enjoy the rest of the conference.